Eliza Meadows were oil and water. Except, instead of not mixing, they mixed it up on the reg. The two of them couldn't be in the same room without bickering like siblings stuck in the backseat of the family Volkswagen on a long summer road trip. Which, if Sam was being honest, was part of the charm of Black Knights, Inc. The people who lived and worked there were more than coworkers or colleagues. They were family. The only family he'd ever known, since he'd been the only son of a couple of South Side meth heads, and since his ex-wife had been little more than a stranger who'd accepted his ring and lived in his off-base condo for a short period of time. His parents had spent his formative years cooking up the poor man's coke in the abandoned warehouse down the road from their shitty apartment, which meant he'd been left to raise himself. Feral. That was a good word to describe his prepubescent self. Neglected and helpless and malnourished all worked too. In fact, were it not for his high school baseball coach seeing something in him and giving him a purpose, he might have ended up another sad South Side statistic. Lucky for him, instead of slinging dope, he'd learned to sling curveballs. Not well enough to make it to the majors, but well enough to get his team to the state playoffs 2 years running. Which is where he'd met a Marine Corps recruiter. Which is how he'd become a raider. Which is the reason he'd popped up on Madam President's radar when she'd been looking to put together her very own fast-action response team. And yes, somewhere in the middle of that, he'd popped the question, walked down the aisle, the steps at the courthouse, and tried as an adult to build what he'd never had as a kid. But that had been little more than a blip on the radar of his life, over before it had even begun. And his ex-wife certainly hadn't filled the hole left behind by his lackluster upbringing. Which brings us full circle, all the way back to Black Knights, Inc. Sam celebrated the day 2 Secret Service agents knocked on the door of his quarters in Camp Lejeune and told him the leader of the free world was making him an offer he couldn't refuse. He celebrated because that offer hadn't just given him the opportunity to do the kind of work he'd always dreamed of doing, taking on the missions that were too hard, too hot, or too politically unwise for the armed forces or the alphabet soup of American agencies to handle. But it had also made him part of a family. A loud, sarcastic, often quarrelsome family. But a family all the same. And sure, there were times he missed the routine and regimentation of the Marine Corps, missed the structure and the stability that came from working under a strict chain of command. But he wouldn't trade the time he'd spent at BKI or the relationships he'd built there for anything. The Marine Corps had given him people to fight beside. Black Knights Incorporated had given him people to fight for. Turning his attention away from Fisher and Eliza, he avoided reaching for his phone by forcing himself to focus on his environment. On the clink of beer bottles and the smooth driving beats of Chris Stapleton crooning from the jukebox. On the leather and denim covering the clientele packed into the place, because it was 10 p.m. on a Saturday night, and everyone who was anyone in Chicago's biker scene considered Red Delilah's the place to be. On the aromas of hops and barley mixed with the saltier, earthier smell of the crushed peanut shells strewn across the floor. Red Delilah's Biker Bar was a home away from home for the Black Knights. Owned by the wife of one of the original BKI operators, it was just about the only place where a group of big, bearded, leather-wearing men could gather without drawing attention to themselves. In fact, at Red Delilah's, the Knights were just another band of tattooed, motorcycle-riding guys in a room full of tattooed, motorcycle-riding guys. Okay, that's not exactly true. It was still tough to blend in when every woman within 30 feet couldn't stop sneaking peeks their way. Blame it on Fisher, who looked like he should be on billboards hawking designer jockey shorts. Or Britt Rollins, who had the kind of boy-next-door face that made women want to ruffle his hair before taking him home to bounce up and down on his lap. Or Hewitt Birch, who'd been told he looked like Sam Hewen's beefier, handsomer brother. Or Graham Colburn, whose 6 feet 5 inches of hard-packed muscle and dark, fulminating stares drew women in like moths to the flame. Or Hunter Jackson, who was currently lip-locked with his fiancée. Sam rolled his eyes at the couple snugged into the corner of the large booth the crew appropriated any time they came to the bar. It afforded them unimpeded views of both the front and the back doors. Instinct, intuition, and too many missions to places where dangerous men toting deadly weapons might burst in meant the Knights couldn't turn off their training, even when they had a night off.